Bonjour, aujourd'hui je suis au Canada, je vais rencontrer une sage-femme qui est experte en accouchement des bébés en siège. Donc je vais dans très peu de temps aller la rencontrer. Voilà, à tout à l'heure.
I've been working as a midwife since 1976, so that means 42 years.
Ok.
And I've been doing breech births for 42 years. A hiatus in between in Canada when we weren't allowed to do them, but I did them when I would travel. Well, it has to do with how I became a midwife, because I became a midwife actually in Guatemala, not in Canada. I became a midwife because I was in Guatemala in 1976 during the earthquake, and there was a large earthquake that killed 25,000 people, and everybody in our village and all around us were losing their houses, and I was coming to people's aid, and I was in my early 20s and knew nothing.
Okay.
And so I learned from the traditional midwives.
Okay.
And traditional midwives don't treat a baby that's breech any differently from a baby that's not breech. They don't think in those terms, or they didn't at that time in the 1970s. And if we had a breech baby, it was just done. Okay. But the difference in Guatemala is that when you do a breech baby, they know that sometimes it's a little more difficult, and so they do all of their births just by throwing they take a rope and they throw it over a beam in this cornstalk house. They grab it and then they squat, and then if the baby's not coming, especially if there's a shoulder dystocia with a head down baby or a breech, they found that often it helps to fall over on your hands and knees. So I just learned that from them. Okay. But at the time I didn't really know at the very beginning that a breech would become such a terribly dangerous thing to do. It never dawned on me. It wasn't part of the repertoire that that's something you have to be afraid of. Well, the way midwifery became legislated in Canada was a roundabout way, in that we were not like Europe. We did not have legislation actually that actually put us in a place of acknowledgement or accredited space up until 1993, 1994 in Quebec and Ontario. And so up until that time, I would do breeches at home if women really wanted it. I knew that it was higher risk, and so I didn't want to do it a lot, but I found that sometimes women just didn't want to go to hospital. And around the time of legislation, we were able to have solidified in our loi, not in the law in Quebec, but in the law in Ontario, we made sure that we had twins and breeches put into our scope of practice. Okay. And we made a decision very carefully to do that. And so at that time we were permitted to do breeches in hospital if we had experience. And I had experience because I had already worked internationally a fair amount. I'd worked in Guatemala and Afghanistan and in Central America. And so I had some breech experience. I'd also worked in Alabama in the States for 3 years. And we had a few breeches there as well. So when I was working as a midwife prior to legislation, a number of midwives did do births with me when we had a breech birth at home. But when I did them in hospital, which I was permitted to do, I did them, usually I would do them with the mothers on their back because the doctors in the hospital wanted me to do it that way. And at that time the doctor had to be in the room. I would do the birth, but he had to be in the room. Okay. But if we ended up with a woman with a breech at home, we would do it in the upright position, which is the way I learned in Guatemala because it made so much more sense to me. But because the requisite maneuvers up until that time that were required by the medical profession in hospital were the flat on your back, extract the baby because you're in charge and the mother's not. That was the type of maneuvers I had to use. So when you ask me, did I train midwives at that time? In some respects I did because I had students, but I was actually trying to help the physicians also understand that it's really useful to use the upright position. And I was able to do that on the odd occasion when a mother was on her back and the heart tone was not good, and I put the mother over, and then they would see that the heartbeat corrected itself, and so they let me go ahead and do that. And I did that not just for breeches, but for twins as well.
Okay.
So yes, I have developed a special practice partly because as an older midwife watching the pendulum swing back and forth around breech, like today it's safe, tomorrow it's not, I started realizing that I was just going to have to put my foot down in terms of my own practice and make sure that women had the choices that they wanted, because I found when we had something called the term breech trial, that was the study that almost put a nail in the coffin for breech birth. Unfortunately, in an embarrassing way for me, it was done out of Toronto, out of Canada. I found that it was very difficult around that time to actually help women to get a breech birth, and so when they would come to me, I would try to find a practitioner anywhere in the city who would do it, but it was difficult because they weren't always on call. Or I'd sent a few people to Ina May in down south in Tennessee, and I sent at least one woman to Nova Scotia where they were still doing breeches. But at that time it was much, and the odd birth I would do at home, but it was very rare. I would do it at home after legislation. And so when the term breech trial came, it was really a difficult time period. It felt like we were going back to the Dark Ages, and we came closer to the Middle Ages around the time in 2004 when the 2-year follow-up to that study was published, and it indicated that in fact cesarean section is not associated with decrease in neonatal mortality. It looked like it was going to be very similar, the outcomes between planned vaginal, planned cesarean birth. And at that point, I was actually working for the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, and I marched down to the Vice Executive President and said, Andre Lalonde, I said, Andre, we've got to do something about breeches now in Canada. We've got to bring the SOGC round on the protocols. And he agreed with me because he was an older physician who recognized that they used to do breeches, and he used to do them at La Salle in Quebec. That was one of the hospitals. So he said, okay, right on, Diane. But at that point, we were trying to figure out whether I was going to stay with I was working for FIGO actually, to try to help midwives and physicians work on the ground internationally. And I said, Andre, I'm going to go to Europe because I want to see what they're doing, because it looks like things have closed down here, even though they should be now opening up, now that it's been shown that there's not really that much difference between a planned vaginal and a planned cesarean birth 2 years after. In other words, there's no long-term damage to a baby. It looks like they have lower Apgars, but I'll go to France. So I go to Port Royal to visit François Goffinet, who had just put out the Premoda study, which was a study in Quebec, in Belgium and in France, that indicated that in units where practitioners are accustomed to doing breeches and where there's a strict set of protocols, the vaginal breech birth is quite safe.